Let's go.
Welcome to Citizen. We have a very special guest today, Kevin Lavelle from Mizzen in Maine. Not Misen, as you pointed out before the show started. How's it going, man?
It's great. It's a wonderful day here in Dallas, Texas, and glad to be chatting today. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, for sure. So tell me a bit about yourself and what you do.
A bit about myself. I'm a very happy husband of 10 years and very fortunate to be a dad of two awesome kids. My son, Jack, is 6, and my daughter, Laura Marie, is 4. We live in Dallas, Texas. It's a great place to live and raise a family. And about a decade ago, I started a company called Mizzen in Maine. Had a crazy idea for a performance fabric dress shirt. After that, spent a few years working for a philanthropy based out of Washington, D.C., and am on startup number 2 to try and help parents regain a little bit of sanity and help develop healthy sleep habits for both kids and parents. So that's me in a nutshell.
Okay, well, let's jump into the fabric stuff. Just out of curiosity, I'm always curious about how companies like this get started. When you say performance fabric, what do you mean?
So the same type of performance fabrics that you'd find, this is a golf polo, in a workout shirt. There's many different types of fibers that make up the different types of fabrics. So some are softer, some are a little bit thinner, some are a little thicker. My idea was to utilize those same fibers to create a dress shirt that looks exactly like a normal dress shirt, but you can wear it with a suit and tie, but has all the performance characteristics that we've come to know and love from all things athletic apparel. So I spent about a year kind of tinkering with fibers and fabrics and figuring out how to get something off the ground. And we launched in July of 2012 with a dress shirt that was the first of its kind. So you can throw it in a washing machine, take it out, put it on a hanger, and wear it in about a half an hour. You don't have to iron it or dry clean it. You can wear it with a suit and tie or a little more casually. But when you look at it, it looks no different than a traditional dress shirt. And that was the goal. And it came from, I worked in DC as a political intern about, 15 plus years ago, which taught me I never really wanted to work in politics or DC. And watched a guy run into a building soaked in sweat. And I grew up playing golf. So I wondered, why had no one made a dress shirt out of the same thing that had transformed the world of golf? Right? When performance fabric polos first came on the scene in the golf course, it was a little bit different. And slowly but surely you would be seen as insane to not wear a performance polo while playing golf because it's just that much better.
Sure.
I wanted to do the same thing with dress shirts. So launched in July of 2012. I figured we'd sell out of our first run overnight because I was introducing a game changer for all guys everywhere. And it turns out there's really no such thing as an overnight success. And we had to actually go build a company. And that was the next many years of my life.
Yeah, imagine that. It's always tough getting started. Because for a lot of reasons. I mean, just getting traction in the marketplace is one of the more difficult things. But it is, I enjoy when people figure out a gap in the marketplace and then solve it. That's what a business is, at its core. And that ideology of solving problems and doing so in a way that benefits both parties, I think, is kind of it's the essence of real capitalism, right? Not what we're experiencing today, which is kind of like corporate fascism, but like actual capitalism where it's like I grow corn and you grow wheat, and I need some wheat and you need some corn. We'll figure out a way to make it work, right? That's we're well beyond that bartering now, but we're definitely into a situation where aside from the big companies, we're in a true creator economy these days. Like, it's never been a better time for the individual to start a business. And I think it's important that we get more people to start businesses that are boutique, that are local, that use local products and workforces, because right now all of the value is being siphoned out of our economy by assholes, right? Whether it be the government or somebody else. And it's never a good thing. It's why we're experiencing inflation and a recession at the same time. That should be impossible, technically speaking. But You've owned this company for 10 years now, and a lot of our people do, D2C stuff here.
Mhm.
How's it been for your supply chain over the past year or two?
Uh, Enormously challenging to say the least. The reality is, I can't remember it's the creation of a pencil paradox or something along those lines. It's been put more eloquently than that. But basically, no one today knows how to make a pencil. So if you had to start from the very uh, raw material and create a finished product as a pencil, effectively no one could do that today because we're so intertwined. And there are pros and cons to that. A global supply chain is a good thing because countries that trade with each other are much more likely to find productive solutions to the challenges that they have. And some countries and some people are better at some things than others. That's all a good thing. The challenge becomes, to part of what you just alluded, when you have rent seekers and people who want to rig the system to protect the power or to protect the monopoly that they have. And there's a very unhealthy and unholy alliance between folks in power to make sure that even though it's the best time ever to start a business today, it's the hardest time ever to compete with legacy incumbents and bigger companies because they're able to rig the system more and more in their favor. And so, I look at the journey that Mizzen and Main has had over the years. No one, thankfully, was able to hold us back from offering a better product. But we certainly face a significant number of challenges just in raw material and shipping and in moving product. I mean, our freight costs to move product had increased something like 700% from 2020 through the end of 2022. Things have started to normalize, and that's a good thing for everybody. Not least of which is the consumers, who at the end of the day are the ones who bear the cost.
Mm.
So it's been a wild ride over the last few years, and glad to hear of fellow entrepreneurs who are looking to continue to create value through that exchange of value. Right, that's the ultimate goal as a business: is you create something that people value, and they exchange something of value to you for that.
I mean, yeah, the ultimate, I guess. I guess the goal would be to, yeah, exchange value at the one-on-one level, and then grow your business to a degree where you're now exchanging value for services and not just goods, right? So that's kind of the building block of a middle class economy, which is to say, like you and I as landowners or whatever back in the day would have been able to exchange stuff, but for people who are laborers, for example, they need those businesses to exist and to thrive in a way that eschews unnecessary automation, that doesn't report necessarily to boards, but rather, is an employee friendly company and not just concerned about, the bottom line and stuff like that. I think it's super important. Like we talk a lot about what it means to be a patriot, I guess, or what it means to be a good steward of your community in general. And a lot of people think that turning a profit, on the left at least, we'll say that turning a profit is somehow intrinsically ignoble, which is fucking stupid, right? I mean, that's kind of the whole purpose of all this stuff, is to buy something for $1 and sell it for $2. So I wonder, from your perspective, you've been in the political game as well. What do you see as some of the challenges to starting a business right now? Because it seems like, especially during all the COVID lockdown nonsense, that big companies got much bigger and some mom and pop companies. So from what we can tell, about 700,000 to 800,000 of them closed forever and will never reopen. So that's life savings gone, right? I wonder, from your perspective, what are some of the key hangups right now? Because a lot of our people are interested in starting businesses and, just being your own boss, having a little freedom, things like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll touch first on this idea when it comes to profit, because you can buy something for $1 and sell it for $2 in a very corrupt way, and you can do it in a very just and noble way. And I think there's been this kind of coalescing of ideological viewpoints where you have, I'll just say again, rent seekers versus those who create value. And that seems to now, in my view, span across the traditional political spectrum from the left to the right, that there are those that abuse that power on all sides of the spectrum, and there are companies that are doing it, again, nobly and justly, and I spent a couple of years working for a philanthropy that Charles Koch has been very involved with called Stand Together. And he writes a book called Good Profit. And it's ultimately about there are good ways to earn profit. And if you create value in society and do it in a way that honors your employees and stakeholders and society writ large, it is one of the noblest forms of virtue and one of the pursuits that we should all be interested in rewarding. So, when I look at business today, what's the hardest aspect? Because I'm starting a second business now. Fundamentally, the greatest challenge that we're all facing is inflation, and inflation is the hidden tax on all of us. And it's taxes are a term fraught with a lot of pitfalls, and people view them very differently. But at the end of the day, inflation hits everybody, and those who are struggling to get by, inflation is especially difficult, because you may have had the ability to start a business, but all of a sudden your savings get wiped out, or just making ends meet looks very different. And that's lost in how we look at monetary policy. It's lost in how we look at policies that affect everybody. And so that's the thing that scares me the most. And, we played fast and loose as a country for a long time with monetary policy. And that's not something that a lot of people vote on. People vote on a lot of things, but what has led us to this point isn't something that I think a lot of Americans either were able to influence or understood kind of what was at play from behind the scenes, because so much of it it's dark rooms, right? It's cigar-filled rooms and closed doors,
Right.
in the halls of power. So the single best thing for everybody will be to get on the other side of this crushing inflation. And when that happens, you have people that are more likely to be able to, whether it's start a very small local business or create one of the next great American businesses. And look, I'm still long-term bullish on the American economy. I think over the next 30 years, this is a better place to be than anywhere else in the world. It doesn't mean that there are things that don't need to change dramatically, or there aren't other countries that are doing things better than us in certain aspects. But long-term, this is still the best place to be. And I hope that we can continue to make that the case.
Yeah. I mean, so people vote on the economy a lot. In a typical election that doesn't have some major social wedge issue, it's like 83% of people vote based on their wallet. But I don't know how many people know things like 75 to 80% of our currency has been printed in the last 24 to 36 months, for example. And what they do hear a lot is the debt ceiling stuff. They hear about how, people in the liberal side of things, well, not even liberal, the leftist side of things, are positing answers like printing a $1 trillion bill to pay debt and stuff like that. I'm not sure the average American has a very good grasp on what the economy is, how a fiat currency operates and things like that. Instead, we were teaching people trigonometry in high school for some fucking reason. I think I like the idea of educating people more, but I'm not sure people have the bandwidth for this stuff. It seems like there's a lot of magicians. I mean, I've worked in politics too, and I did it for one campaign season just to see what it was like. And I've always hated politicians ever since then, because they're the most corrupt people in the world. But you do have to get involved at some point. And you're probably right. I don't know what the average American with their vote or with their actions can really do about inflation at this point.
Yeah, there's certainly not a lot that anyone American can do at this point. I think people underestimate utilizing their voice for their local congressman or woman, or their local or their state senator. It matters, I think, far more than people understand. This is the reality of social media. It's the reality of politics. A very small number of people create the most noise and the most perceived direction of where things, where the mood of the country is. And so just some level of regular engagement with the individual who happens to be representing your district or your state matters a lot, because when people who work in those offices get those phone calls, there's some level of bubbling up. Hey, here's what we're hearing. So I would encourage everybody to reach out to whoever represents them, even if you disagree with them on 98% of issues. They represent you in Congress or in Senate. The secondary piece of this, what can any American do? Um, Local politics matters far more than I think anybody realizes. Whether it's your city or at the state level, right? State representatives or state senators, not just federal. It matters a great deal. And good people need to get engaged. I know very good people who've gotten engaged in politics and quickly become disillusioned and walked right back out the door. And I understand and I empathize with that. But sharing your voice and going to school board meetings, and actually participating in local politics, it matters. I think the last thing would be, in every opportunity that you have, respectfully disagree and have dialogue with people in your neighborhood and in your life. I think we've gotten to this point where people are either screaming or everyone is just keeping their mouth shut for fear of retribution. And my experience is most people that you encounter are very open to having a dialogue, even if you disagree wholeheartedly. And the more that we can voice rational and reasonable opinions and have dialogue, I think the better example it sets for everybody. I don't understand the hold that political parties have on this country, because I just don't see the world through that binary lens. Because if you were to ask any, let's say, very strongly oriented political person, whether they're in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, to list off all the issues that their party supports, I don't think that they would necessarily be able to. And I also don't think that they would say, I agree with 100% of that.
Sure.
But we've gotten into this world where people see things in such a binary fashion, and no part of life is that cut and dry, where there is absolutely no middle ground. And I think the other thing that unfortunately we've gotten kind of sucked into as a country is a lot of times bipartisan means that we just agree to continue to go in this direction and don't, argue with each other. And that direction is more spending, more debt, more concentrated power, and kind of more support of folks who are able to drive rent-seeking behavior. So any chance that you get as an individual, as a citizen, to just be calm, be rational, be respectful, and speak up, that matters a lot in my book.
Yeah,
and from the folks that I continue to talk to, I see positive opportunities, but we need more folks to speak up.
Yeah, and get engaged. I mean, you don't have to run for political office to be politically engaged. You don't have to actually support any particular political candidate or party either. This is something I say on the show quite a bit, but Plato once said that if you refuse to take part in your own governance, you're going to be ruled by fools, right? I mean, that's it's the translation's weird. It could have been your lessers, but either way, I think the point stands. And yeah, on the dialogue part, I try to get people to do this more and more. And it's different strategies for different people, I guess. But one of them is the principle of charity, right? Which is like a first century Jewish scholar came up with this idea that you should, in a debate, take your opponent's statement or opinion at its best possible meaning instead of assuming the worst. That's a good strategy to use, I think. Another thing is when you're getting ready to argue or debate or discuss something with somebody, and look, you shouldn't be afraid of that, first of all, because the less we debate, the more hardened and ignorant we become in our own positions, which is never a good thing. But, think to yourself when you're getting ready to respond to someone, is there a way that I can ask this question or make this point that illuminates the similarities of our positions instead of illuminating the differences, right? Because I find that most people, like if you ask people general banal questions about economics and government power in their lives, they will answer pretty much the same. Like you're going to get the same from a libertarian. You're going to get the same and from like distrust of the government than you will for somebody that lives in a fucking ghetto somewhere. You know what I mean? Like it's the thing that unites them is that they want to have control over their own lives. And and what we know about not having control over your own life, whether it's at a macro or micro level, is that it breeds nihilism very quickly, right? And then for for people who are disenfranchised, it breeds generational nihilism, right? Which is much more difficult to repair because instead of having an open young mind to educate, now you're having to tear down a bunch of, walls that are built by people who experience shit that was a lot different than what's happening right now. We see that a lot now. People, these kids in the Pacific Northwest are so angry about about the way the government operates. I'm like, yeah, I'm with you, bud. Totally with you. But the conclusions you're making are absolutely preposterous. Like the landscape that you're defining doesn't exist. You know what I mean? But it is interesting because there are problems, and we can all tell that there are problems. It's becoming difficult, or it's maybe not becoming difficult. Maybe it's just been difficult to define them in a way that everybody agrees on the definition, right?
Sure.
Like people on the left, and look, these are generalizations, but people on the left don't want the government telling them what drugs they can take or what women can do with their bodies, for example. People on the right don't want the government telling them what they can do with taxes or their guns or whatever the fuck else, right? These are you're explaining the exact same problem here, right? Which is that people want to have control over their own lives. They don't want to be fucking nannied all the time. And how do you intimate that to people en masse that have such varied opinions?
Yeah. I can't remember where I'd heard this before, but at the end of the day, most people want what's best for their family, right? They want their kids to be able to grow up in a world that's safe, and they want their family to be able to continue to grow and prosper. Now, there's a lot of different tactics and there's a lot of different ways in which that can be realized, but most people, and I would say we're talking the vast majority of Americans, would agree that they want the same things for their families. There's a lot of different ways in which that can come to be, but I wish that I remembered this statistic exactly, but it was something like of 700 or so counties that voted for President Obama twice, 227 of them or so voted for President Trump in 2016. Now, that's one of the most illuminating statistics I've heard. These are counties who voted for President Obama twice and then voted for a very, very different candidate in 2016 in so many aspects of their personal life, of their policy, all of those things. Why would that be? Well, because things weren't necessarily going substantially or exceptionally well for a lot of people when it comes time for the next presidential election. So they say, well, I'll try this person. Maybe they'll be more helpful to me and my family this time, as opposed to a very hardened view that it's all one direction or all the other direction. At the end of the day, people want to be able to take care of their families. And so that's what sort of animates my view of the world. And again, to a point that we discussed earlier, you don't necessarily have to get involved politically to be someone who cares about local elections, state elections, or the folks that are representing you, and retaining an ongoing dialogue with them. And then lastly, to just sort of reiterate this point overall, if you can't talk to somebody at all about an issue, it may be time to kind of take a step back and say, well, where are things that we can agree on, and sort of just reestablish that baseline and see that humanity in the other side or the other person or whatever that might be. There are exceptions. There are full-blown nihilists or people that really do not want positive and good things in this world. That's a very, very, very small percentage of actual folks. And there are no shortage of great examples of people sitting down who have completely divergent viewpoints and finding that shared humanity. And that's something I'm going to continue to try and encourage folks to do.
Yeah, me too. What do you think? What role do you think the attention span or whatever you want to call it, the lack of academic rigor, the average opinion holding American has these days? Because you talked about things weren't necessarily going well under Obama. Obamacare really pissed a lot of people off. There's no question about that, especially people on the left who voted for it thinking that they were going to keep their doctors and their rates are going to be low and things like that. I know a lot of people felt some kind of way about that. But um, the big economic issue was the housing market crash, right? That happened early on as an administration, and it took a while that was a global recession. It took a little while to come out of that. And it almost immediately, when you have that conversation, I've had it many, many times, it almost immediately devolves into, well, that was the Bush administration leading into the Obama administration that did that. Like, okay, cool, yeah, but it was Barney Frank that set up all these subprime loans in the first place, that wrote the legislation to allow this shit to happen in the first place. It was corporate interests who pay both Democratic and Republican candidates, that the rent seekers in this regard, who are manipulating the economy, really, this was a bipartisan effort to fuck everybody over, right? And it becomes very obvious. All you have to do is kind of look into it a little bit. I wonder. I do a lot of suicide prevention stuff because it's a big deal in the veteran community. And one of the issues is that people are depressed or nihilistic or feel some kind of way, and they spiral very quickly. Oftentimes there's a 5 to 15 minute window where everything feels hopeless and somebody does something drastic that they wouldn't have done if you could just hit the pause button for a few minutes. And then conversely, if we could somehow train people to, when they see something, some piece of information, that they just spend 10 or 15 minutes looking into it, right? That very small amount of time can change a lot of stuff, I feel like. And I'm not sure exactly how to do that. I mean, what I tell people is that if you see a new piece of information, the more you believe it, the more you want to believe it, the more skeptical of it you should become. Because especially these days, the media is custom tailoring things to try to invade your mind. What advice would you have for people in that regard? And then, from a leadership perspective, have you found any methodologies that might help get people to slow down for a sec? You know what I mean? Because a lot of people just want to dunk on everybody. Like, no, that's wrong. Here's the proof. Fuck you. Like, all right, cool, man. I mean, I guess you won, but what the fuck did you win exactly?
Sure. So we do, Mizzen and Maine has been working with an organization in Dallas called Adaptive Training Foundation for many years. And it's started by a former Mr. Irrelevant NFL guy named Dave Vibora. And he started this gym. You guys can look it up. I would definitely recommend it. But started this gym and ended up meeting a guy named Travis Mills. He was a quadruple amputee, and Dave said, come train with me. And Dave's eyes were open to many of the challenges faced by, specifically at the time, military amputees. Just in, like, as he says, one of their greatest enemies is gravity. If you go through rehab after an amputation, you might get the most basic skill levels back, but things like getting in and out of a car or falling down start to look very different if you are an amputee. That's a very shortened version of the background. What he ultimately did was build a gym that helps people who are facing any kind of disability regain the independence and freedom in their life across the military and civilian divide. And one of the things that he did was he did not want it to be a veteran-only program because, as he said, veterans don't live alone in the world. They live alongside civilians. And there is real benefit for civilians and veterans to go through programs like this together. I give some of that background because I think it helps a lot in terms of some of the lessons that I've experienced from Dave and his program. But he has talked about helping people basically hit that pause button when things are spiraling. And whether you're a civilian, whether you're a veteran facing any level of difficulty, he talks a lot about mindfulness, and there's a lot of practices and programs. But one of his tools is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I might butcher this slightly, but if you are spiraling out of control, if you are really facing a difficult moment, even if you're just arguing, vehemently with your partner or your spouse, stop and look around. What are 5 things that you can see? What are 4 things that you can hear? What are 3 things that you can touch? What are 2 things that you can smell? And what is 1 thing that you can taste? And just that very simple process makes everything stop around you, because you really have to think. And sometimes we get in these very automatic cycles where everything is moving a million miles a minute, and Twitter dunking is a great example of that. The pylons just happen so fast, but just hit pause and do that 5 4 3 2 1. And when you do that, you are taken out of the automatic cycle. If you're in fight or flight or anything else, that ability to move from the subconscious to the conscious mind, because you have to think about it, is one of the greatest tools that I've ever seen, especially for folks facing extreme mental duress, or in a very difficult or potentially life-threatening situation. The other thing that I would say is, don't overestimate, and I'm guilty of this as well, the reality that most people don't live very online lives. So whether it's Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, whatever it might be, whatever the controversy du jour is, if you were to ask most people across the country, they would probably have no idea what you're even talking about, because most people are going to work, trying to take care of their kids, trying to take care of their parents, dealing with whatever shit they have in their life. And so what I try and do when I see this craziness happening is just step back and away from it. And I will regularly just stop using social media altogether for a month at a time. And it's amazing how much calmer I feel in my own life. I know folks that are, we're talking about how many people understand the nuances of monetary policy or things like that. I doubt that I could explain it very well, and I pay a lot of attention to it. But I know friends who are exceptionally brilliant people, extremely gifted and very in tune with the world, who basically at any given moment think the world is literally about to end, because they are so sucked into the chaos that they don't really realize that certainly the media is manufacturing it, but also the speed at which these cycles are happening online because of the nature of tech companies and eyeballs and clicks and journalists, and whether they're citizen journalists and not a part of the media, or the center of those that create the narratives that we live by at the center of the media. It's all about eyeballs, and it's all about engagement across the spectrum. And so, coming back to what's a tool that you can use, a friend of mine, very brilliant entrepreneur, basically said, I haven't read the news in 15 years. Ryan Holiday wrote a book called Trust Me, I'm Lying, and it's about media manipulation. And my friend basically said, I don't read the news. I just read history. And what it does is help me understand that everything we're experiencing, some version of it has happened many times over throughout human history. Now, some of the technology may be different, right? War has certainly changed a lot over the last 100 years, even over the last 20 years. No one had a cell phone in their hand 30 years ago. But at the end of the day, these things that we're experiencing, it's just a slightly new flavor of a thing that we face throughout all of human history. And so reading history rather than news has a way of calming the mind and helping reassure that it's just a new flavor of the same old problem. And a very funny point to drive this home, a way to remember this concept is, if you think the news is important, read the news from 6 months ago. Mm-hmm. Like whatever was on the front page of the news or whatever trending BS topic was at the top of Twitter from 6 months ago, see how much of a difference it makes in your life reading it today. Probably zero. And at the end of the day, coming full circle back to this question about inflation, there are things that we can do in our life to improve the situation around us, but there's not a lot we can do to change the macro picture in any given moment, other than, as Jordan Peterson says, don't lie, right? Make your bed, treat people with respect and dignity. If you do those things right, a lot of the rest of the things in your life will somehow come together as they need to.
Yeah, it's a good point. A couple of things. One is the the problem of that there are some jobs that just intrinsically deal with crises all the time. Cops, firefighters, ER nurses and doctors, soldiers sometimes, people in politics, even a lot of people in the news. And it's easy to get sucked into that. I mean, if it bleeds, it leads, I believe is the quote from the CNN producer. But sure. It's true. It's rubbernecking. It's a car pileup or whatever, and people get sucked into that stuff. Everything starts to look like a crisis, right? The human mind is designed to distinguish between threats and benefits. Ultimately, that's the job that it does. And, you're dealing with what data folks call GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. If you're getting bad data, right,
Mm-hmm.
or uncontexted, I guess, data, then it can look really bad. And aside from, well, I guess it's kind of compounded by how, especially the younger crowd these days, are being taught to catastrophize everything, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
as, and like if something, I like that idea of the historical perspective. If something's fucked right now, something weird's going on, or whatever it is, it probably is a useful exercise to find some historical perspective on that, because
Yeah,
we people these days, it's always, everything is always the first or worst, right? It's,
sure,
this is the worst in history, or the first time it's
sure.
ever happened. Very rarely is that actually true, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we just keep repeating the same stuff, like all the stuff that's going on in American government right now with, the rise in corporate fascism, and the the marriage between the state and large corporations. That's nothing new. Like, this has happened before. As a matter of fact, it's happened in America before with the printing press back in the day, right? Um,
I mean, it's much more the norm than the anomaly,
sure.
right? Especially when you look back. I mean, right, the what was it, the East India Trading
Trading company. Yeah.
Company, right? That's the norm, right? Things today are actually much more exceptional in terms of what humans have faced throughout all of time. And to your point around, it's either the first or the worst. Maybe it is the first time this has ever happened, but it's not the first time that something like this has ever happened. And again, I continue to be long-term bullish on America. I continue to be long-term optimistic about the prospects for society. It doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to push hard and hold ourselves and our leaders accountable. But the prophesizing around doom is, I think, it's a very normal thing. If you read history, right? This is a very normal thing. People have always assumed that the world is going to end soon.
Oh yeah,
And yet
Nostradamus,
somehow,
one of the most famous writers in history, is
right,
all. It's like that's all it is. It's just it's like a
yeah.
doom-filled horoscope, basically.
And when you look, I'm reading a book right now on Ulysses S. Grant, and when you look at what was happening during the Civil War, um, it certainly felt like the world was ending, and for good reason. And the things that were said and the things that were done were unimaginable in their horror at the time. Yet somehow, sticking to values and continuing to, let's say, fight the good fight, over time, things got better. And, if you look at the history of human progress over the last 200 years, 100 years, 50 years, 25 years, things have gotten demonstrably better. And there is no way to argue with that. Of course, there are exceptions. And of course, there are still bad things that happen. And sorry, I don't know if you can hear, my dog is dreaming in the background, making hysterical noises. I look at ultimately, there are things that could take us off that course, and it doesn't mean just be laissez-faire and let anything happen. We do still need to be vigilant. We do still need to push for what we know is right. But if you take a step back, if you tune things out for even just a few minutes, I think we will all find that things are nowhere near as bad as it seems. And ultimately, again, talk to normal people who don't spend much time online, and you will not find that same sense of doom and gloom. You may find, given the situation we find ourselves in today with inflation, people are really struggling, but they're not struggling about the things that everyone is screaming at each other online about. And getting that little bit of separation, I think, can give a lot of clarity around what actually matters and what's really important.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. And, to your point about just the catastrophizing that happens throughout history, even when it's, I suppose during the Civil War, it was probably warranted to some degree.
Sure.
But we think when it feels like things are going nuts, like the world is ending, and maybe it is the case that the world as it is, or your world as it is, does end. Something new
Sure.
always takes its place, right? That's kind of how it works.
Mm-hmm.
Like you go from one relationship or job to another, you move homes, you have to file bankruptcy or some shit, and then you make a comeback from that. It's You have to be ready to be part of, if not the solution to whatever the problem is, you have to be
Mhm.
ready to be part of whatever the new thing is, right? It doesn't help
Mhm.
to woe is me and bury your head in the sand. And it reminds
Mhm.
me of this old, super, I hate motivational quotes, but it's something like, whether you think you can or you can't, you're right. You know what I mean?
Sure, absolutely.
Ultimately, you got to be prepared to live in whatever the fucking world is going to be. You know what I mean? Whether that means being
Yeah.
able to provide food for yourselves, being able to stay warm if it gets cold out and the electrical grid's down, whatever it is, right? I'm not trying to go
Mhm.
full prepper here, but
Yeah.
it doesn't. It's not a dumb thing to be ready for things like that.
Sure. Yeah. And I think one of the overarching lessons I feel like I've learned over the last few years, from some very bright folks, is the need for real intellectual humility. And there are a lot of people who feel very confident that they know what is going to happen next in their policy prescriptions, in their global policy prescriptions, whether it was around some of the things that happened with COVID or terrorism, or just go back in time, right? People said, this is what's going to happen. And if you have that level of certainty, you're either lying to yourself or you're lying to everyone else, because it is impossible to understand what is coming. Absolutely no one predicted COVID. Absolutely no one predicted 9/11. Absolutely no one predicted go back in time. And so I just try and sort of say, like, I'm going to do the best I have with what I have in front of me. But it would be foolish for me to make that level of prediction about even my own life, let alone everyone around me, or within my company. This is exactly how we should do things, or this is what the policy should be for every single person in the country. There's a level of there's a complete lack of humility in making that level of certainty in predictions. And that's the thing that I find the most concerning about politicians, whether on the left or right, is this sense of certainty around it has to be this way or it absolutely cannot be this way. Again, that lack of gray area. There are very few things in life that have true no gray area. Um, Yet we want in life for things to be black and white. And you know, uh, in tragedies that happen in society or in our own lives, when you talk about some of these policy prescriptions, people will point to the edge case and say, well,
Mm.
what about that thing? And the unfortunate reality is there are just some bad things that happen in society. There are some bad people that you cannot control every aspect around. Yet we design policy and we want to design our lives as if we have that total control. And perhaps it's because we have more control of the world around us than we ever had before, right? You can get around the world in what, 14 hours
Mm.
is the longest direct flight today. You can get halfway around the world. So it feels like we should have more control. But, whether it's Mother Nature or unpredictable things that happen in society around us, I also try and just remind myself that we can't and will never have that much control over the world around us.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think what you're describing sounds to me like, um, it sounds like panic to me. It's like
Mm.
people at the individual level have, maybe because of the soft times we're living in these days, but they've lost their appetite for any kind of pain or whatever it is.
Yeah.
There's no resiliency anymore, because the truth is life is unpredictable. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and it seems like we in the West have we've decided to trade in our liberty for a little bit of safety and security, yeah, but also for
Mm-hmm.
convenience, which is far more
Yeah.
upsetting to me. Like this is the unlocked door that lets the wolf in. This is the your this is the security weakness in the construct of liberty in general. It's that
Mm-hmm.
instead of being able to, not just able, but able and willing to solve your own problems and solve problems at the lowest possible level through your community and your family and whatever else it is, we rely on larger and larger organizations, whether they're governments or businesses or PACs or whatever it is. And that shit ain't free, man. I mean, it's like they're getting something out of that deal. Now, sometimes it makes sense, but for the vast majority of those things, even if something begins in a noble way, all it takes is one shitty leader to seize that power, right?
Yep.
And that's the whole point of federalism. It's the reason we set up our system of government the way we did, which is to diffuse federal power as much as possible and make sure that states had rights, make sure that local communities had rights. And that's the ultimate inoculation to tyrannical bullshit. That's the reason we set it up this way. But it doesn't really work that way anymore. Like a federal agency filled with unelected bureaucrats can change a policy and turn people into felons overnight if they feel like it, right? And you can go through the courts for recourse, and we've done that multiple times these days. But that's a real thing that exists in our government, in the United States government, in the 21st century. And I think our 18th and 19th century counterparts would have been super fucking pissed off about that.
You know, when you talk about the liberty and security, I think this is a great example of the challenge. You can look back in history, and it happens in various iterations, but the challenge across the political spectrum in this never-ending slide towards more concentrated power. And there are things that are very unequal in society, and there are things that need to change. But the left and the right have sort of locked arms together in terms of the traditional left and right in this continued slide towards a higher and higher concentration of power. And they sort of hand off back and forth to each other. Well, we'll let you do this, but you got to let us do that. Lavelle had I think it was a podcast with Joe Rogan many years ago. And I love the way that he said it. He said, the perfect system is one where you design it and then hand the keys over to the person you deem your polar opposite or enemy in ideology to run it for the next 10 years. That's the perfect system. And unfortunately, we live in a country where we have fewer and fewer liberties as individuals. And I don't think anyone could really argue that that's not the case. Now, people may say, I like that I'm okay with that trade-off. But ultimately, we have less power, we have less autonomy, and we have less ability to make decisions. And different political factions are pissed off about that for different reasons. But that is a very concerning element, especially with the acceleration of technology that drastically amplifies some of these characteristics and some of these things that we're seeing.
Sure, yeah. I mean, when you say technology, are you talking about creative destruction or?
No, the opposite. The concentration and the ability to amplify power with the use of technology. So if you think about surveillance, if you think about camera technology, the last time I was in China was probably 6 years ago or so. And I found myself, people talk, it's a little Black Mirror these days. You can't really do anything in China anymore without WeChat. And you really can't move more than a few feet without going from one surveillance camera to another. And so I was having a conversation with someone recently. They were saying that some future predictor person was saying that, they predict that China will fall as we see it today. The powers that be will fall within the next decade. Maybe, and I have no idea. And I think anyone that claims to know is again lying to themselves. But what we haven't seen is the level of control through surveillance and technology that exists today at any point in time in history. So while many things repeat themselves throughout history, in China with the social credit score, with WeChat basically controlling every aspect of your life and surveillance, it is possible to basically not be able to do a single thing in that country that you want to do, right? And so people who write a bad check or have to declare bankruptcy for a potentially legitimate reason may never be able to do anything again for the rest of their lives. And so certainly there could be an uprising or, a downfall of the powers that be, but we just haven't seen something like this with this level of power play out before. I say that, who knows, maybe there's some version of that in history that I haven't read yet, and need to continue to brush up on my history. But the use of technology is quite frightening today in terms of centralizing power. And effectively the inability to really mount a proper defense, especially given the potential costs in doing so.
Sure, yeah. I mean, the state has unlimited resources to come at you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and look, the China examples are obvious to our crowd. It's something that they follow a lot, but there's Western examples of this as well. I mean, we know that the FBI has been illegally surveilling pretty much everybody in the country at what, like, however the fuck they feel like doing it. The Patriot Act was a huge mistake. When you talk about creating something and handing it off to your worst enemy, right? That's kind of the litmus test for a good bill. A good bill is clear, concise, and enforceable. Yep. Those are the three things that you want out of a bill. The clarity is that it's obviously very obvious what it's talking about. Like it applies to this thing. Being concise means it's limited in scope. And
a normal person could read it.
Right, yeah. Limited in scope, meaning that it's not a generalization. It doesn't ban a bunch of shit or criminalize a bunch of ancillary behavior. It's specific to one thing. And obviously, enforceability means it has some teeth, right? It's not just like a crime must have a victim. That is the general idea, but we don't really obey that idea anymore. Crime is just now defined by something the government doesn't want you to do in a lot of ways. Now, the examples in the West of technology being leveraged against us, some of them are pretty obvious, like social media being. I hear people talking about hacked voting machines and shit like that, and who fucking knows, man? I don't know. I don't think that happened, but maybe it did. But it's far more effective to hack somebody's mind, to pump them with bullshit all day long and have them voting on stuff that doesn't actually have any impact on their daily life. And we see that happen all the time now.
I don't know if this is true or not, so I probably shouldn't repeat it, but at least the idea sounds like it has merit. In the United States, TikTok, which I won't even sort of unpack all the problems with TikTok, but it's people dancing and it's all sorts of, the normal social media garbage. In China, apparently TikTok shows educational videos and is kind of aspirational, inspirational, the message that the state wants people to have. And when you look at that across an entire population, as you say, that may be far more effective than even the most nefarious proposals that could be put forth otherwise, is literally changing the mindset of a population over time. I tend not to be as nihilistic or doomsday about social media as others. I do think it's a huge challenge and a huge problem. But again, look back in history and people used to say that about the printing press, and people used to say it about music or TV or whatever it might be. Kids these days have always been wrong in the eyes of elders. But I do think there's a lot of good that comes from it. And I certainly appreciate and I appreciate and don't think we should underestimate the shortcomings or challenges.
Right. Yeah. And another example is I don't know if you followed the trucker protests in Canada or not, but a lot of money was raised on different websites. Gibson Go is where they ended up later on, but they started with some of the more popular crowdfunding sites, and the Canadian government subpoenaed those organizations and froze the bank accounts of people who gave more than $25 to the movement. That's fucked. That's one of the worst things that I think I've ever heard of a government doing in the West, to be honest.
It's frightening when ideas and speech end up being policed at that level. Because at the end of the day, that is what we're talking about, is ideas and speech are being policed. I've seen tremendous calls for censorship from both the traditional left and the traditional right. And it's basically, if I don't like the idea, it's either not okay, should be banned, or, the extreme is that it's effectively, we should compare you to Hitler. And the instant Hitlerization of speech today shows how unserious we are about real, dangerous, actual, problems in this country and frankly in the West writ large. And so there are very, 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 very few things that should ever actually be banned from a speech perspective. And there is this reflexive power grab today from the powers that be, whether it's left or right, to just shut down speech. And that is potentially the most dangerous thing that we can do. because when you shut down speech and you shut down ideas, people stop thinking and stop being able to do just about
Mm.
anything. And so that is one of the things that I am relentless on. Is there's just almost nothing that we should ban. You can say there are venues where it may be more or less appropriate. There are certainly things in schools that are more or less appropriate for ages, but by and large, we shouldn't be banning speech or ideas. And that goes all the way through to how we allow people to conduct financial transactions. And it's frightening. This is where technology starts to be very different, right? When payment processors are no longer either themselves allowing or even allowed to conduct certain transactions, we're starting to face a pretty serious problem from a speech perspective.
Sure. Yeah. One of the biggest impediments to authoritarianism used to be that you had to have collaborators from amongst the population, right? You had to have enough people in the population willing to effectively do violence on behalf of the state to maintain the authoritarianism. Now, technology will allow governments to move past that. They will be able to seize your assets, right?
Mm-hmm.
They will be able to take your livelihood away with a computer stroke instead of sending cops to your house or whatever it is, right? Instead of sending the National Guard or whatever the fuck they used to do back in the day in the 19th century. That should be concerning for anybody. I know that it is unfortunately the case that people on one side or the other very frequently don't really give a shit if it's their opponent getting fucked over. But that's kind of that's how bad shit always happens, right? It's first they came for the socialists, and I wasn't a socialist, so I didn't stand up. And they came for the trade unions, and I wasn't a trade unionist, so I didn't stand up. And then they came for the Jews, and I wasn't a Jew, so I didn't stand up. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to stand up for me, right?
Yeah.
That is the danger. It's not just about. We're not moralizing the issue here. It's not just about being a good person. There's a practical reason to do this shit, and it's to decentralize power and to insulate communities from being able to be oppressed by them. You know, I don't understand why this is so difficult for some people to understand.
I think because it's just easier to support the seizing of power. It's
I mean, people do like to support a
it.
winner. People like to feel like they're on the winning team. That's a true statement.
People also like to be in power and even adjacent to power. And one of the things that I feel like resonated most with me as I first sort of started listening to Jordan Peterson and reading his books and have a lot of admiration for his courage and conviction in speaking speaking the truth. One of the points that he made was most people like to assume that in World War II, they would have been Schindler. And in reality, the statistics prove otherwise in terms of the number of people that either were directly a part of the Nazi party or were sympathizers or sort of enablers. That I think it was 1 in 3 people ended up being some sort of informant or supporter of the Nazi state. And so you think about, at the time, family of 6 was very normal. Statistically, 2 of the people were supportive of the state or the party in some capacity. That's really frightening. And so coming full circle back to something that we talked about from the beginning, what can we do? What can you and I do? What can any given person do? Take care of your own house, right? Don't ever lie and don't support liars. Speak the truth no matter what. And if you do those 2 things, look after your own house and build a strong family and speak the truth, then you can have time to worry about other people, right? If you do those 2 things first, you'd be surprised how much better your life can get. And then all of a sudden things around you can get a lot better. But ultimately, I see this in people that I know and all around us. It's a lot easier to yell and scream and point at other people than to turn inwards and look at what's wrong in my own life and what can I be doing to be a more positive contributor to myself, my family, my community. And then I can start to worry about a lot of those other things. But there's a lot of ease and momentum in going along with the crowds and the mobs and the screaming and the yelling, and it can feel very good. because it also distracts you from focusing on what should you be looking after in your own life.
Yeah, and it goes both ways too. I mean, this is basically the inverse of the bystander effect, right? Like the
Mm-hmm.
more people around not doing something, the less likely it is somebody will do something. But then
Yes.
the momentum of the crowd. We see this in uh, when I was at Penn State. I have a master's degree in homeland security, but one of the some of the stuff you study there is you know, group psychology in mass casualty events and then in protests and things like that. And just little things. Sometimes it doesn't even have anything to do with the protest. Like there will be an internal dispute inside of the protest. Two people will start fighting and then there's a riot, right? That had nothing to do.
Mm-hmm.
They're not rioting necessarily over the cause they all came for. They're rioting because two assholes started fighting. It's
Right.
this psychology is very contagious. And you know, it does sound daunting. I mean, for a lot of people, especially people who have, this is one of the problems we faced in Iraq. They've been so used to being told what to do all the time. It was hard to get them back in the mindset where, hey, you control your own life now. You got to start doing some shit. You
Yes.
got to think for yourself. You got to make your own way here. It was very difficult to get people to take control of their life again. And I understand it from that perspective, just
Yes.
being conditioned over time and things like that.
Of
But
course.
it sounds difficult. It sounds like a pain in the ass, but to me, it's good news. It means you actually have some control over your life. And that's the thing that people want, whether they can admit it to themselves or not. This liberty streak that particularly Americans have, that's what it's rooted in. I want to do what I want to do. And, you've got the ability to do that. It just comes at a cost. There's going to be a cost for that, just like there's a cost for anything else. If you want to go to Disneyland, it's $400 a ticket. If you want to fucking control your own
Yes.
life, you got to stop acting like an asshole. You know what I mean? And start taking control.
I mean, I'm sure many of the folks listening to this have come across Jocko Willink in some point in time, some form or fashion, but extreme ownership, right? Every single thing that happens in life is yours to own. And certainly there are externalities that you can't control, but what you can do is say, I get to decide what I do next. And that is the most daunting and fulfilling and uplifting thing possible. There are going to be things that happen that we don't like, that aren't fair, any of whatever. But you can decide how you react, and you can decide what can happen next. And you can also say, thank God I'm the person dealing with this, because I don't know if anyone else could handle it in that way. And it's easier to be a victim. It's easier to point the finger. It's easier to assign blame to any number of different aspects of life or society or your family. But nothing will change if you do that. You might be able to incite a mob or, piss a bunch of people off and get them to agree with you, but it's not actually going to change anything positive in your life.
100%. All right, let's wrap this up then. It's been a great conversation. I really appreciate you coming today. Is there anything else you'd like to share with these guys before we get out of here?
I think we've hit all of these points, but I would just maybe close with every single one of us has a chance to look after our own body, our own mind, our own family, and make a positive impact there first. And if you can do that, then you can start to make an impact on those around you. And again, that's one of the most uplifting things possible. And when you see a pile-on, when you see a mob, don't participate. Help steer people in another direction.
Yeah, be a fucking leader.
Be a leader.
Like if you care about the things around you and you're unhappy with the way they're going, the only answer to that is to be a leader and lead things in the other direction. That's the only way you can do it. And tell everybody about the company again.
Yeah, so the company is called Mizzen and Main, Mizzen AND MAIN. You just start Googling Mizzen, it'll show up. But we created the world's first performance fabric dress shirt, and now we have everything a guy needs to look great, feel great, and as we say, conquer comfortably. Check us out and appreciate the support.
Cool. Yeah. Well, thanks for coming today, man. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Appreciate the conversation.
And we appreciate you all listening. This has been Citizen.